Imagine catching your fiancé with your own sister, then marrying the city's deadliest mafia boss just hours later. That is exactly what Nora did. She thought her life was over when she found her fiancé's belt undone in her living room. Instead of crying, she walked into a grimy dive bar and sat next to a man who shoots people for a living. By sunrise, she was legally bound to a criminal empire, securing his assets and saving her own life. Are you ready to see how a broken bride became the most dangerous woman in the underworld? Imagine walking into a grimy dive bar where your shoes stick to the floorboards and the air smells like bleach, stale beer, and cheap gin. That is Nora tonight. 2 hours ago, her life was painfully ordinary. Now she is drinking with a mysterious man in a tailored suit that probably costs more than her life insurance. She has no idea he runs half the city's criminal underworld, and honestly, she is too angry to care. All she wants is to burn her wedding plans to the ground and never hear the name Arthur again. But before we get to the man, the gunshots, and the insane marriage papers, we need to go back to where the disaster really began. Nora was heading home through the suffocating August heat, balancing boxes of wedding favors on her hip as she unlocked the door to the apartment she thought was still hers. Nora thought her fiancé, Arthur, was still at the office working late and eating some sad desk salad under fluorescent lights. He was not. She also did not expect to find her own sister Lydia hiding in her apartment like she belonged there. As the door creaked open, Nora dropped her keys. The sharp metallic clatter rang across the entryway, loud enough that it should have warned the two snakes inside. She called Arthur's name while kicking off her shoes, her feet aching from standing in caterer lines all day. The apartment was dead silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Then she heard it, fabric brushing against the wall, a muffled gasp, and the kind of heavy breathing that made her stomach tighten before her mind even understood why. That was the first real warning. The second was Arthur saying her name from the living room, in a voice that already sounded guilty. Nora rounded the corner, still clutching the box of honey jars for the wedding favors, and froze. There, pressed against the expensive floral wallpaper they had argued over for 4 miserable hours, were Arthur and Lydia. It looked like some trashy modern Renaissance painting, except no one in it had any dignity. Arthur's hands were tangled in her sister's blonde hair. His belt was unbuckled and hanging loose. Nora could not stop staring at the tarnished brass buckle, the one she had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, after he complained that all his old belts looked cheap. Her mind simply shut down. When Arthur saw her, he panicked, choking out her name and stumbling backward over the rug like he had been electrocuted. Lydia, though, did not even flinch. That was what hurt most at first. Not the betrayal itself, but the confidence. As if Nora had interrupted something inconvenient, not something unforgivable. Lydia slowly pulled down her silk top, which was actually Nora's because she had always helped herself to Nora's things. The nerve of it was almost impressive. Nora was still holding the wedding honey jars, the cardboard cutting into her fingers, but she refused to drop them. Dropping them would mean making a mess, and she was always the one who cleaned up everyone else's messes. She had cleaned up Arthur's forgotten bills, Lydia's emotional disasters, her mother's complaints, and even the wedding plans Arthur barely pretended to care about. Nora told Arthur the caterer needed another $1,000 by tomorrow. Normal sentence that it made the room feel even more obscene. Arthur started trembling, his tie hanging off the couch like a dead blue snake, as he tried to lie his way out of it. He stammered that nothing had happened, which was almost funny, considering his belt was still open. Nora shut him down at once, asking what exactly had not happened. Did they simply not finish? The question cut through the room like a knife. That was when Lydia's cheap vanilla and citrus perfume hit her, thick and sweet, making the apartment feel even hotter than it already was. Lydia let out a soft, fake sob and wrapped her arms around herself like she was the injured one. She said she was sorry, claiming they had only been talking about the wedding dress, and then things somehow just happened. Nora stared at her, trying to understand how someone could steal your shirt, your fiancé, and still expect sympathy. Arthur stood there, sweating desperately, trying to thread his belt back through his pants with shaking hands. It was pathetic in the ugliest way. Nora wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the honey jars and watch glass burst across the wall. Instead, something colder moved through her. Something quiet. Something that did not feel like weakness. Nora did not scream. She did not throw plates. She did not ask why, because the answer would only insult her twice. All she felt was a hollow ache spreading through her chest, cold enough to steady her hands. 3 years together, a shared lease, a joint bank account, and 300 wedding invitations already sitting in mailboxes, all of it collapsed in a single second. She walked to the coffee table and set the heavy box of honey jars down with a hard thud, Then she told Arthur to keep the apartment and said she would send someone for her things on Monday. Arthur's eyes filled with panic. He stepped forward, whispering her name, like he still had the right to use it softly. When he tried to grab her wrist, Nora did not move. She looked down at his trembling hand and told him that if he touched her, she would break his fingers. He stopped immediately. For the first time all evening, he understood her perfectly. Nora walked out without looking back at her sister. No screaming, no dramatic door slam, just the quiet click of the lock behind her. In the hallway, which smelled like cheap carpet cleaner and old paint, she waited for the elevator and watched the numbers drop from 5 to 4 to 3. Her chest felt wrapped in iron, but she still could not cry. A strange part of her kept thinking about practical things: cancel the photographer, call the venue, stop the second cake payment, freeze the joint account before Arthur emptied it trying to fix his guilt with money. When she stepped outside, the heavy city air hit her like a slap. A taxi idled by the curb, the driver smoking a cigarette with one hand hanging out the window. Nora slid onto the sticky vinyl back seat, numb from head to toe. The driver glanced at her in the mirror and asked where she wanted to go. She had no answer, not a real one. She told him to drive and get her as far from that neighborhood as possible. The driver shrugged, flicked his cigarette into the street, and pulled into traffic. Neon signs blurred through the wet window, while Nora's phone started buzzing nonstop. Arthur, Lydia, her mother, Arthur again. She turned it off and buried it deep in her purse. She needed a dark room where nobody knew her name and where floral wallpaper did not exist. The cab carried her across town, away from clean sidewalks and wedding boutiques, into a rougher district where half the streetlights were dead and the air smelled like rain, ozone, and wet garbage. The driver asked once if she was sure. Nora handed him cash and got out before he could change his mind. Some nights, rock bottom does not feel like an ending. Sometimes it feels like the first honest place you have stood in years, because at least there is nothing left to pretend. Nora walked into a dive bar called the Brass Nickel, the kind of place where people went to drown their problems quietly, not some trendy spot packed with college kids taking photos of cocktails. The sticky floorboards tugged at her shoes. The air was thick with stale beer, old cigarette smoke, and the bitter smell of men who had been losing arguments with life for a long time. She took a stool at the far end of the scratched counter, and the huge bearded bartender asked what she wanted. She said whiskey, and told him to leave the bottle. He studied her face for half a second, saw something there that made him stop asking questions, and slid over a glass with a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon. It was exactly what she needed to dull the pain. It was also the worst place she could have chosen if she wanted a quiet ending to her night. She poured a heavy glass of bourbon and swallowed it down. It burned like acid in her empty stomach, but she poured another anyway. The bar was mostly empty, except for a few men playing pool in the back and a dusty jukebox dragging out a slow blues song. 10 minutes later, the stool beside her scraped across the floor. Nora did not look up. She kept tracing a water ring on the counter and told the stranger the seat was taken. A deep, rough voice answered calmly that it was not. She almost laughed from pure anger. Of course, some random creep would try to hit eye on her, while her whole life was still bleeding open. She turned, ready to snap, ready to use every cruel word she had swallowed in that apartment. But when she saw the man beside her, the words died before they reached her tongue. This man did not belong in a place like this. He wore an expensive dark suit, perfectly tailored, with his tie loosened and the top button of his shirt undone. But it was not just the clothes that caught her attention. It was his face. A nose that looked like it had been broken and set again, and dark eyes so intense they seemed almost black. He looked exhausted, like a man who had not slept properly in years, but there was nothing weak about him. His large hands were marked with faint scars, and a heavy silver watch sat on his wrist. He did not even look at her at first, yet the whole room seemed to bend around him. The bartender saw him and straightened. The men at the pool table suddenly became interested in anything except making noise. Nora noticed all of that. She was drunk, heartbroken, and reckless, but she was not stupid. Without a word, the man raised 2 fingers. The bartender came over instantly, poured him something expensive from a bottle hidden under the counter, and left without asking for money. Nora, made reckless by cheap bourbon and humiliation, lost her filter. She told him he was dressed too well for a dump like this. He took a slow sip, eyes on the dirty mirror behind the bar, and said people coped in different ways, especially since she was drinking cheap liquor like water. Nora laughed bitterly and asked what a man like him could possibly be coping with. A stock market crash, a bad tailor, a tragic shortage of imported cigars. That was when he finally turned his head and looked at her. His gaze moved over her face, her messy hair, the tension in her shoulders, and then landed on the engagement ring, still sitting on her hand like a bad joke. He pointed to the ring and said she was staring at it like she wanted to cut off her own finger. Nora corrected him. Ex-fiancé. Her hand shook as she poured another drink. She told him she had just caught Arthur with her sister against the wallpaper she had paid for. He did not offer fake sympathy. He did not say he was sorry. He did not try to make it smaller or cleaner than it was. Somehow she appreciated that. He only said it was messy. Nora agreed completely and drained the glass as the first warm numbness spread through her body. Then he did something strange. He asked what Arthur did for a living, annoyed by the question, but answered anyway. Accountant, careful, boring, afraid of risk. The kind of man who labeled leftovers with the date and still forgot anniversaries. The stranger's mouth barely moved, but she thought he almost smiled. Nora said the worst part was not even the betrayal. It was the planning. The deposits, the caterers, the ridiculous price of a custom 3-tier wedding cake. The stranger dryly admitted he did not deal in baked goods. She sighed, thinking about the 300 guests she would have to call, and the humiliation waiting for her in every conversation. Then he slowly swirled his glass and asked a question so strange she thought she had misheard him. Why cancel? Nora stared at him. He looked at her with terrifying calm and suggested she keep the party but change the groom. Nora laughed because there was no other reasonable response. She asked if she should run into the street and flag down a replacement husband. He did not laugh with her. He studied her like he was measuring something she did not know she was revealing. Her anger, her pride, the fact that she had not begged Arthur for an explanation, the fact that she was wounded but not broken. So there she was, joking that the line of backup husbands was probably wrapped around the block. And come on, most people would have made the same joke, but this man, nothing, pure ice. He only stared at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Before Nora could ask what his problem was, the heavy doors of the bar slammed open so hard it sounded like a gunshot. She jumped, her elbow slipping off the counter. 3 men in cheap leather jackets walked in, and the whole room went still. The pool game stopped. The bartender's hand disappeared under the counter. Nobody spoke. The man beside her did not turn around, and his hand slipped beneath his jacket. Nora felt the atmosphere change before she understood why. A room does not die that fast unless everyone inside recognizes danger. She should have left then. She knew it. But fear does not always move your legs fast enough. A thug with a scarred face stepped forward and said, "Victor, you're a hard man to find." So that was his name, Victor. He only sighed as if this was an inconvenience, not a threat. He told them to walk away because he was having a drink. The thug was not interested in that. He said his boss wanted a word now. Victor calmly told him his boss could wait until Monday. Then the man pulled a gun. No warning, no dramatic pause. 1 second his hand was in his pocket, and the next gray pistol was aimed at Victor's back. Nora's brain could not keep up. She did not scream. She just froze, staring at the barrel. Victor's eyes flicked to her through the dirty mirror. Later, Nora would understand that he had already calculated everything. The distance, the angle, the bartender, the men at the door, and the civilian woman foolish enough to be sitting beside him. Victor moved with terrifying speed. He did not even stand. He turned on the stool, his hand snapped out, and a deafening crack tore through the bar. The scarred man screamed and dropped his gun as red spread across his shoulder. The other 2 reached for their weapons, but Victor was already moving. Nora, to get down, grabbed her shoulder with one huge hand and shoved her hard onto the filthy floor. She hit the ground so fast the air left her lungs. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Someone cursed. A bottle exploded above the bar, showering cheap liquor across the counter. Nora curled into a ball, with her eyes squeezed shut, her cheek pressed against sticky wood, praying she would make it out alive. Pride disappears quickly when bullets start flying. So does heartbreak. For those few seconds, Arthur and Lydia felt very far away. The shootout lasted maybe 10 seconds, but to Nora it felt endless. When the noise finally stopped, all she could hear was someone groaning near the door and a broken neon sign buzzing above them, and hauled her off the floor as if she weighed nothing. Her legs were shaking, but Victor stood there almost untouched. His expensive suit jacket was dusty, and that was it. In his hand was a smoking black gun. He told her it was time to go, as casually as if they had just finished dinner. The 3 men were on the floor, wounded and cursing into the grime. Nora stared at them, sick with shock. Some people live in a level of danger the rest of us only see from a distance. Nora had not just seen it. She had been dragged into the middle of it, and Victor was looking at her like leaving her behind was no longer an option. Nora choked out, "Oh my God, you shot them." Victor grabbed her hand in an iron grip and said they would live. But the cops would be there in 3 minutes, and she did not want to answer questions about a mob hit. She had no argument for that. He dragged her out the back into a dark alley that smelled like garbage and rain. Water plastered her hair to her face. Only light came from a red exit sign buzzing above the door. Victor pulled her toward a sleek black sedan parked by a dumpster, shoved her into the passenger seat, and ran around to the driver's side. Nora reached for the door handle, but he locked it before she could jump out. She yelled at him to let her go. He looked at her once, hard and direct, and said if he did that, the men who saw her face would find her before sunrise. She stopped yelling. The engine roared to life, and they tore out of the alley just as sirens started wailing in the distance. Nora was pressed against the leather seat, hyperventilating, the adrenaline burning away every drop of alcohol and leaving only cold panic behind. She screamed, asking who he was and what had just happened. He kept his eyes on the road, taking sharp turns through narrow streets, and said, "Victor Moretti, you sat next to the wrong man at the wrong time." Moretti. The name landed hard. News headlines, rumors. The Mafia family everyone whispered about, but never discussed too loudly. This was not bad. This was catastrophic. One random seat in one ugly bar had just rewritten her entire life. Victor checked the mirror, jaw tight, and for the first time she noticed he was not calm, because he felt nothing. He was calm because panic would waste time. Nora had just watched a legendary crime boss shoot 3 men over a glass of whiskey, and even saying it felt unreal. Victor checked the mirror and said smoothly, "I'm a businessman, and right now I have a problem. A problem." Nora yelled that he had just shot 3 people. He shrugged, like it was a minor inconvenience, but his eyes kept moving, watching every headlight behind them. Then he reached into his jacket, tossed a phone onto her lap, and told her to dial a number. She was supposed to tell the man who answered to meet them at the warehouse on 5th and bring the paperwork. Nora stared at the phone like it was a live grenade. Victor said her hands were steadier than most people's after a shooting. She snapped that it was probably shock. He said shock was useful if she could still follow instructions. That was not comfort, but somehow it made her breathe. Nora demanded to know what paperwork had to do with anything and told him to let her out of the car. Victor looked at her, completely serious, and said he could not. The men he had shot were part of the Russo crew. They had seen her face. If he dropped her off, they would find her by morning, just to get to him. He said she was staying with him until he knew she was safe. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. Suddenly, Arthur cheating on her felt like a paper cut compared to a bullet wound. She started babbling that she had work on Monday, that she was a marketing manager, not collateral damage. Victor's mouth curved slightly. He said she had walked out of a ruined engagement without begging, threatened to break a man's fingers, and managed not to scream during a gunfight. For a civilian, that made her unusually useful. Nora hated that the compliment steadied her. The nervous man answered on the first ring, and Nora repeated Victor's instructions. 10 minutes later, they pulled into a massive warehouse that looked like it belonged in a nightmare. Shipping crates rose out of the shadows like monuments, and one harsh light hung over a metal desk. A sweaty, balding man in a wrinkled suit paced beside it, clutching a briefcase. Victor told Nora to stay close. They got out, her heels clicking loudly against the concrete. The man rushed over, wiping his forehead, stammering that the Russos were making their move, and they had to secure the estate before the federal agents froze everything by 8 in the morning. His name was Leo, Victor's lawyer, and he looked like every secret he carried had taken a year off his life. He kept glancing at Nora like she was either a miracle or a heart attack, maybe both. Victor asked if he had the documents. Leo said yes, then looked at Nora and nearly lost his mind. He told Victor the trust only transferred the assets to a married heir, and Victor did not have a wife. Worse, the spouse had to be a real person with a clean record, no ties to the Russo family, and enough public visibility to survive a board review. No escorts, no paid actresses, no fake identities. The old Moretti patriarch had designed the rule to stop exactly this kind of criminal shortcut. Victor looked down at Nora without saying a word, and anger in her brain turned into one reckless burst of courage. He needed a wife to save his empire. She needed protection from the men who had seen her face, and somewhere beneath all that, she needed to prove she was not just a pathetic woman discarded by a cheating accountant. Before she could stop herself, she asked how much of a hurry he was in. The voice did not even sound like hers. It sounded wild. Victor said he had about 4 hours. Nora asked if she signed whether she would get protection from the killers he had just shot. He stepped closer, smelling like expensive tobacco and gun oil, and said, "You get my name. Nobody touches a Moretti. Not the mob, not the government." Nora told him she wanted Arthur to know. Victor's jaw tightened, and he promised Arthur would read about it in the morning paper. Leo was practically hyperventilating, insisting Victor did not know this woman. Victor snapped back, asking if Leo had a better idea. Then he looked at Nora more carefully and asked why she would do something this insane. Nora wanted to say revenge. She wanted to say spite. Instead, she said she was already in danger because of him, and if the world was going to destroy her old life, she wanted some say in what came next. That answer made Victor go still. Victor ordered Leo to prepare the papers. Leo scrambled to the desk, scattering legal documents everywhere, then handed Nora a heavy fountain pen. She walked over and stared at the clean white page that was about to split her life in two. Her hand hovered over the signature line. A small, rational voice in her head screamed, "Nora, what are you doing? You are marrying into the Mafia hours after catching your fiancé with your sister. This is not courage. This is a nervous breakdown with paperwork." But then she pictured Arthur with Lydia pressed against her wall. Lydia wearing her shirt, Arthur saying nothing had happened. The anger came back, hot and steady. Victor stood behind her, close enough that his shadow covered the page, but he did not touch her. Quietly, he said she could still walk away. That almost made the choice harder. Nora gripped the cold pen and signed before fear could talk her out of it. With Victor standing behind her like a wall, Nora pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name. Nora Hayes, soon to be Nora Moretti. Victor reached over her shoulder, his warm, calloused hand brushing hers as he took the pen. Then he signed his name with brutal efficiency. Leo squeaked, "Done," and grabbed the papers like they were solid gold, promising to file them before anyone could interfere. Victor turned to Nora, but her adrenaline chose that exact moment to collapse. The room tilted. Darkness crept in around the edges of her vision. She tried to say she was fine, because saying anything else felt like surrender, but her body had reached its limit. Victor murmured, "Let's get you home, wife." And the word struck her somewhere deep and frightening. She took one step and her legs gave out. Victor caught her before she hit the floor, as if he had been expecting the fall all along. The last thing Nora remembered was the smell of expensive wool and the terrifying steadiness of Victor's arms around her. When she woke up, sunlight cut through heavy charcoal curtains. Her head felt like it was full of water, and her mouth tasted like old pennies. She was lying on a massive mattress with crisp, cold sheets that smelled faintly of cedar. She opened one eye and realized this was absolutely not her bedroom. Her bedroom had an ugly water stain on the ceiling and a closet door that never closed properly. This place was pure luxury, quiet and heavy and guarded. For one strange second, she thought maybe she had dreamed it all. Then she saw the diamond ring on the bedside table, beside a glass of water and 2 aspirin. If you ever wake up in a Mafia kingpin's bed after signing marriage papers in a warehouse, your old life is not just interrupted, it is over. Let us skip the slow build, cause Nora was already deep in chaos. Imagine waking up under a vaulted ceiling while your brain replays the worst night of your life in broken pieces. A sticky bar floor, a gunshot, a man bleeding near a metal desk, a fountain pen in your hand, and Victor Moretti calling you wife. Her stomach flipped. She bolted upright and clutched the blanket like a shield. She was wearing an oversized gray t-shirt that smelled like expensive tobacco, which made her panic immediately. She checked under the covers and, thank God, her underwear was still on. Then the door clicked open. Victor walked in, dressed in a fitted shirt and black pants, looking completely calm, as if last night had been nothing more than a long meeting. His calm made her angrier than the gunshots had. At least gunshots admitted something was wrong. This man did not look like someone who had arranged a legally suspicious marriage and escaped a Mafia shootout 12 hours earlier. He looked like a regular man, mildly irritated that his morning coffee routine had been disturbed. He walked over and set a steaming mug of black coffee on the nightstand. "Drink," he muttered, his voice rough as gravel. He told her she had been out for 9 hours. Nora curled up, feeling tiny in that enormous bed, and managed to ask if they had actually done it. Victor stared at her, deadpan, and asked if she seriously thought he had consummated a warehouse marriage, while she was barely conscious and covered in rainwater. He told her his housekeeper had changed her wet clothes, and only because Nora had been sleeping like a corpse. Embarrassment hit instantly, then suspicion followed. Nora asked who had checked her background and how much they knew. Victor did not pretend innocence. He said Leo had run an emergency check before filing the papers. Nora Hayes, 30 years old, marketing manager. No criminal record, no major debts, no political family, no hidden connection to the Russos, and a very public engagement that had just exploded. Clean enough for the trust, visible enough for the board, angry enough not to faint at the first hard question. Nora stared at him. That was why he had looked at her in the bar, like she was not just a drunk stranger. He had been weighing her, measuring whether her pain could be useful. She hated him for it. She also hated that he had not lied. She picked up the hot coffee with trembling hands and took a sip. It was strong, bitter, and exactly what she needed. Then she asked if the marriage paperwork was real. Victor leaned against the doorframe and said it was legally binding in New York. Filed at 6 that morning. asset secured. Russo family furious. So Nora had married a mobster. Victor corrected her immediately. He called himself the head of a logistics empire and described the violence as aggressive negotiation. When she reminded him that he had shot a man in a bar, he called it self-defense. Apparently, the police had written it off as a gang dispute, and the man he shot was already in some basement clinic, having the bullet removed. Victor stepped closer and asked if she was going to scream, because if she was, he might need to check the soundproofing. Nora wanted to cry. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to go back 12 hours and choose any other stool in any other bar. But under all that fear, a stubborn spark of spite stayed lit. Arthur had made her feel replaceable. Lydia had made her feel foolish. Victor, for all his darkness, had made her necessary. That did not make him safe. It only made the trap more complicated. That stubborn spark was the only reason Nora did not collapse. She looked Victor in the eye and told him there would be no crying. But she wanted her things back, her laptop and her toothbrush, at the very least. She had a marketing strategy due by Tuesday. For 1 second, Victor looked genuinely confused. He asked if she was seriously planning to go to work. Nora told him she was a marketing manager with a retirement plan, standing meetings, and a boss who used the phrase circle back without irony. So yes, she was going to work. He made a dry sound that might have been the closest thing to a laugh he allowed himself. Then his face hardened again. He reminded her that she was a Moretti now. His enemies knew her name. In glass conference rooms and pretend nothing had changed. She was not just married. She was a target. The truth settled over Nora like cold water. She asked if that made her his prisoner. Victor said it made her his wife. According to him, she had to stay inside his enormous compound under heavy guard until the Russo problem was handled. Losing freedom is a terrifying thing, especially when it arrives dressed as protection. Nora's head was pounding, but she refused to fold. She insisted on getting her clothes and seeing Arthur one last time. Victor's jaw tightened. He offered to send his men. Nora said no. That man had humiliated her, wasted 3 years of her life, and stood there with his belt open, while her sister cried fake tears. She was not going to let strangers pack up her sweaters, while Arthur pretended to be sorry. She was going back for her dignity as much as her belongings. Victor watched her for a long moment, then checked his watch and gave her 30 minutes to shower. The bathroom was ridiculous. Black marble, multiple shower heads, expensive soaps lined up like museum pieces. Nora scrubbed away the smell of cheap alcohol and rain, though the memories of the night before stayed right where they were. When she stepped out, a fresh stack of clothes waited for her. Dark designer jeans, a soft cashmere sweater, and her own boots, polished until they looked new. Everything fit perfectly, which was impressive and deeply unsettling. Downstairs, she found Victor in a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a luxury magazine. Sleek metal appliances, dark wood cabinets, and a center island so large it could have seated a small board meeting. 2 huge men in dark suits were whispering near the door. They straightened the second she entered. Nora realized, with a sick little twist in her stomach, that this was her new normal now. Beautiful rooms, expensive silence, and armed men watching every exit. Victor sat at a glass table, focused on his tablet, with a plate of untouched toast beside him. Without looking up, he ordered Nora to eat. And even though it tasted like cardboard, her empty stomach needed it. She asked how he knew her exact clothing size. He answered casually that he paid people to find out details like that. Nora told him that was not as charming as he probably thought it was. He finally looked up, and for half a second, something like amusement crossed his face. Then he tapped the tablet, locked the screen, and slid it across the table. Page 4. He said. A bad feeling moved through her before she even looked down. The screen showed a local gossip blog, and her heart dropped. The headline said a mystery woman had married Victor Moretti to secure his empire. There was no photo, thank God, but her full name was printed right there. Nora whispered that her mother read that blog. Victor stood, grabbed his coat, and said at least her mother knew she had married up. Nora glared at him, but the fear under her anger was real. Victor warned her that the Russos read the news too, and now they knew his money was locked away. They would almost certainly be watching her old apartment. Even so, he promised they would go. Then he tossed her phone onto the table and said she had left it in his car. Nora grabbed it fast. The battery was almost dead, and the screen was flooded with notifications. Arthur had called 14 times. Lydia had called 8. Arthur had texted again and again, begging her to come home so they could talk. Even her mother had texted, asking why Arthur was crying and whether they had canceled the caterer. Nora stared at the screen and felt something inside her finally go quiet. 24 hours earlier, a text from Arthur would have made Nora's stomach flip. Now it felt empty. She sent him one message. She was coming for her things. He needed to pack them, and he was not to speak to her. Then she shoved the phone away and looked at Victor. He did not offer empty comfort. He only gave her a calm, serious nod. They got into a huge black vehicle with bulletproof windows and dark tint. Victor drove, while one of his armed men sat in the front passenger seat. The trip to Nora's old neighborhood took about 20 minutes. When her modest brick apartment building came into view, her old life suddenly looked small and fragile compared to Victor's guarded fortress. It was strange. Yesterday, that building had been home. Now it looked like a place where a version of her had been trapped for years and had not noticed. When they pulled onto Nora's street, 2 black cars were already waiting. 4 hard-looking men in suits stood on the sidewalk, smoking as if this were normal. Victor parked and told her his crew had checked the block, but she still needed to keep her head down. The summer heat hit her the moment she stepped out. Victor walked beside her like a shadow, his eyes moving constantly over windows, rooftops, parked cars. He was not trying to be charming. He was watching for threats. Nora felt exposed in a way she had never felt before. Every curtain looked like it might hide someone. Every parked car looked too still. She wanted to ask how people lived like this, but Victor's face gave her the answer. They did not live like this. They survived it. They skipped the slow elevator and took the stairs. By the 3rd floor, her heart was pounding. And here they were, right in front of Nora's apartment. She stared at the crooked brass numbers she had been meaning to fix for 2 years. Funny how little things like that survive, while whole relationships fall apart overnight. Her hands shook as she reached for her keys, but the door swung open first. There stood Arthur, looking like a complete wreck. Greasy hair, yesterday's pants, eyes wet with relieved tears. He tried to hug her, but halfway through the movement, his face went blank. Behind Nora stood a huge, perfectly dressed man who looked like he could end Arthur's entire life before breakfast. Arthur's hands dropped. His brain seemed to stall. He stared at Victor, clearly wondering who this man was and why Nora was not alone. Victor did not bother with introductions. He moved forward just enough to invade Arthur's space. He did not shove him. He did not need to. Victor delivered the bomb in a low, cold voice. "I'm her husband." Arthur let out a weak, nervous laugh and looked at Nora as if waiting for her to say this was a joke. Nora only stepped inside with Victor beside her like a terrifying stone guardian. It turns out quiet people do have limits. Arthur had just found hers. Inside, the air felt poisonous. Nora's sweet vanilla candles mixed with Lydia's cheap citrus perfume until the whole room made her sick. Arthur started sweating, begging her not to throw away 3 years over one mistake. Then he actually tried to blame the wedding stress. Nora turned to him so sharply that he stopped mid-sentence. A mistake is forgetting a reservation. A mistake is spilling coffee. Cheating with her sister against a wall she had painted herself was a choice. He flinched because the truth landed harder than shouting. Right on cue, the bedroom door creaked open and Lydia stepped out. She wore Arthur's oversized college sweatshirt, her hair messy in that carefully effortless way she had practiced since high school. She froze, switched into fragile victim mode, and whispered Nora's name. Nora wanted to scream and tear the whole apartment apart, but she could not lose control. Not with Victor standing there, like an anchor made of steel. Weakness would not help her here. She was learning that fast. To Victor, and told him her clothes were in the bedroom and her laptop was on the desk. And 2 enormous men in suits stepped into the apartment. They were silent, disciplined, and terrifying. Victor told them to pack her things, and they went to work, ignoring Arthur and Lydia completely. Arthur suddenly found the smallest scrap of courage and tried to block one of the guards. Bad choice. Victor barely moved. In a voice cold enough to freeze the room, "I would strongly advise against touching my men, Arthur." That was all it took. Arthur stopped at once. Some fights are lost the second you choose the wrong opponent. Arthur took one look at Victor's dead dark eyes and went pale. He backed away until his spine pressed against the floral wallpaper. Nora walked through the living room as if both of them were invisible. She grabbed what mattered and left the couple photos where they were. Her favorite mug, her headphones, her marketing books, her grandmother's silver bracelet from the drawer. On the outside, she looked like some icy Mafia wife. Inside, she was shaking so hard it felt like her chest might cave in. She was still just a regular woman trying to survive a nightmare. Sometimes pretending to be strong is the first step toward becoming strong. But pretending does not stop the pain. Then she saw a small framed photo on the end table. It was a picture of her and Lydia as teenagers laughing on a beach, sunburned and happy, and completely unaware that one day they would stand on opposite sides of a ruined life. Nora stared at her sister's smiling face and her vision blurred. Her fingers slipped. The frame hit the floor and shattered, scattering glass across the boards. Arthur flinched. Lydia gasped. Nora stood there, looking down at broken glass across Lydia's face. while one tear escaped before she could stop it. She hated herself for crying in front of them. She wiped it away fast. Then a large hand appeared beside her. Victor knelt without hesitation, completely unconcerned by the sharp glass, and helped her gather the pieces. It was not soft, it was not sentimental, and it was real. He picked up the photo and brushed away the glass with his thumb. He handed it to Nora without so much as glancing at Arthur or Lydia. Then he murmured, "Leave the glass. Let them walk on it. No pity, just a dark, practical understanding of revenge." Nora took the photo. Nora could hear the performance in it now. Arthur whispered that he still loved her. Nora looked at him one final time and realized love had never been the problem. His love had always required her to shrink around his weakness. 10 minutes later, the guards were loading her boxes into the SUV. She did not say goodbye. She left her keys on the counter and walked out. Monday morning, Nora was living in a completely different universe. Rain lashed against the huge windows of Victor's study. On paper, she should have been pitching a third-quarter digital ad campaign in a corporate boardroom. Instead, she sat at a massive mahogany desk in a borrowed silk blouse, staring at her laptop. Her boss, David, complained over Zoom that her audio kept cutting out and asked if she was in a noisy coffee shop. Nora hit mute quickly because the banging outside was not construction. It was Victor's men smashing open crates to search for tracking devices. Her work-from-home situation had become complicated. She unmuted and switched into the bright, fake corporate voice everyone uses to survive meetings. She lied about a plumbing issue and started explaining click-through rates, conversion drops, and why the landing page needed a cleaner call to action. Halfway through the meeting, the heavy doors opened, and Victor walked in. He wore a black dress shirt, had a deep purple bruise along his jaw, and white athletic tape wrapped around his knuckles. The worst part was the bright red droplets on the tape, which were definitely not his. Nora froze. 9 to 5 is hard enough without your new husband. Walking in looking like he just returned from a private war, her boss said, "Nora, did we lose you?" Victor did not care. He walked straight to the bar, poured himself a heavy glass of scotch, and drank it in one swallow. The sharp smell of sweat, copper, and gunpowder filled the study, cutting through the usual cedar scent. Nora tried to stay professional, forcing herself to say they should split test the landing page whilst staring at the screen. Victor leaned against the bar, watching her with tired, heavy eyes. Whatever Victor had spent the last 3 hours doing had drained him. He looked from the glowing laptop to Nora's pale face, and even he seemed to notice how absurd the scene was. The contrast was ridiculous. She was talking consumer metrics. He had clearly walked in from a violent turf dispute. Victor rasped, "Wrap it up." Nora reached for the mute button and missed. David heard him and asked, "Is that Arthur?" Victor, with no concern for normal workplace behavior, said loudly, "Arthur is irrelevant." Nora's heart nearly stopped. She shrieked at the screen, frantically hitting buttons, then lied that her contractor had a dark sense of humor. She promised to email the slides and slammed the laptop shut. When your life changes overnight, some of the old boundaries collapse before you are ready for them. Nora spun in her chair and asked Victor if he had lost his mind. Victor only shrugged and muttered, "Maybe years ago." He looked exhausted, his usual control worn thin around the edges. Then he told her to get dressed because they had a dinner in 2 hours. Nora stared at him. A dinner. He was literally bleeding. He glanced at his taped knuckles and said, "It's not mine." The rival boss, Carmen Russo, had requested a sit-down on neutral ground, and Victor intended to go. The trouble was not slowing down. It was gathering speed. Carmine wanted to see the wife, who had locked him out of $50 million in port assets. Nora's stomach turned. She asked if she was supposed to sit across from a mob boss and pretend to be happy. Victor leaned over the desk, trapping her in her chair with his presence, and said he wanted her to sit there and prove she existed. Up close, the cut along Victor's jaw looked vicious. He explained that Carmine thought she was a fake, a shell company with a heartbeat. If he pushed hard enough, he expected her to crack. If she cracked, the board would question the marriage, the trust would reopen, and the Russos would come for everything. Nora asked why he did not just bring lawyers, not respect papers until people bled over them. Nora felt sick. She was shaking. When she asked what would happen if she fell apart under pressure, Victor told her she would not. Not because he was comforting her, but because he sounded certain. He reminded her that she had caught her fiancé with her sister, broken glass, packed her life into boxes, and walked out without begging anyone to love her. Fear was allowed. Surrender was not. Then he left her address and told her to be ready by 7. The next thing Nora knew, they were in an elegant, deeply suspicious basement restaurant downtown. Low lighting, red velvet, silent men at the doors, and a tension so thick it felt like another person at the table. Nora sat there in a dark emerald slip dress that fit her perfectly, looking calm, even though she was sweating through every second. On her finger was a diamond so large Victor had practically turned it into a target when he forced it onto her hand in the car. Then Carmen Russo arrived. He was older, with slicked-back silver hair, greedy black eyes, and a suit so shiny it looked deliberate. He smiled like a man who had never apologized for anything. Into his veal piccata, with creepy mechanical precision before turning his attention to Nora. She understood immediately that this was not dinner. It was an interrogation with better lighting. Carmine started digging through her background, mocking the leap from corporate marketing to the inner circle of the city's most feared Mafia family. It felt like the worst job interview in history. Nora swallowed her panic and gripped her wine glass so hard, her knuckles turned white, just to keep her hands from shaking. But she did not fold. She told Carmine that corporate skills were highly transferable, amused by her nerve, and said she was far more entertaining than Victor's usual quiet girlfriends. Victor sat beside her looking calm, but his hand hovered near the gun hidden under his jacket. He cut Carmine off and said Nora spoke for herself. Carmine smiled wider. Then he pulled a thin envelope from inside his jacket and slid it across the table. Inside were photos of Nora leaving the Brass Nickel with Victor, photos from the warehouse, and a blurry shot of her signing the papers. The polite act disappeared. Carmine pointed a silver butter knife toward the photos and called the marriage exactly what he believed it was, a fake. He knew Victor had pulled her out of a cheap dive bar to trigger his father's trust. Victor stayed cool, saying the paperwork was done and the money was locked. But Carmine had done his homework. He brought up Nora's ex-fiancé, Arthur, that miserable little accountant. Then he casually threatened to send men to break Arthur's typing fingers, convinced her past would be enough to make her crumble. Nora's stomach turned, not because she loved Arthur, but because Carmine had reached into her old life and touched something that still belonged to her. Then Carmine added Lydia's name. He knew where she lived. He knew Nora's mother had a weak heart. He said fragile families were useful because they cracked loudly. That was when Nora understood Carmine was not just loud or cruel. He was dangerous because he knew exactly where to press. Victor's jaw tightened beside her, but Nora sensed the trap. If Victor threatened him, Carmine would call it proof that Nora was a weakness. No, he had found the right weapon. So instead of breaking, something inside her shifted, not fear, rage. Clean, white-hot rage. Arthur had ruined her life, slept with her sister, and left her shattered on the floor of her own apartment. Lydia had made her betrayal look like an accident. Her mother had always asked Nora to be the reasonable one. And now this oily gangster thought he could use all of them like strings. Nora set her wineglass down with a sharp clink, looked Carmine straight in the eye, and told him to go ahead with Arthur. Her voice was ice. Carmine went still, the butter knife trembling slightly in his hand. Nora leaned forward and told him Arthur was not leverage. Arthur was a man who had thrown her away and then cried when someone else picked her up. If Carmine wanted to scare her, he needed better material. Then she turned the knife. She said if his people went near her mother or Lydia, he would not be hurting Victor through Nora. He would be teaching Nora exactly where he kept his courage, because only a weak man threatens women outside the room. The restaurant went silent. Even Victor stopped moving. Carmine stared at her, trying to decide if she was bluffing. She was terrified, but she did not look away. Beside her, Victor began to laugh under his breath, low and dangerous, and far too pleased. Carmine's favorite weapon had gone dull in his hand. Victor looked at Carmine and said, "You heard my wife. The accountant is useless, but touch her family, 1 crate on my dock, or $1 at my trust, and I will come to your house myself." His voice stayed quiet, which made it worse. Carmine's face tightened with fury. He slammed the butter knife down, scraped his chair back, and warned them that the trust required a real marriage, not a paid actress with a good mouth. Once the board found out they were faking it, he said, the money would go right back into play. Then he looked at Nora and added that real wives knew things. Real wives had power. Real wives survived more than one dinner. That line stayed with her. Carmine stormed out with his bodyguards, but he did not leave defeated. He left planning. "Give me the phone so feel it." This was not over. It had only become personal. The second Carmine was gone, Nora deflated. The adrenaline drained from her body, leaving her shaking so badly she had to hide her hands under the table. She could barely breathe. Victor turned to her, all amusement gone from his face. In its place was an intense, searching look. He reached under the table and wrapped his warm hand around hers, steadying the tremor. He told her she had not flinched once, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. Nora whispered that she had been terrified. Victor said fear did not matter if the enemy never saw it. That should have sounded cold. Somehow in his mouth, it sounded like respect. He leaned closer, smelling of scotch, tobacco, and danger, and told her she was a very dangerous woman. Then he called her Nora Moretti. Hearing that name sent a dark little spark through her chest, and she hated that she liked it. On the drive back to his compound, Nora watched the rainy neon-lit streets slide past the window and realized her moral compass was in pieces. She had told a mob boss that Arthur was useless as leverage. Maybe she had not given Carmine permission to hurt him, but she had not begged either. That scared her. She had always thought of herself as decent, practical, the kind of person who recycled and remembered birthdays and tried not to wish harm on anyone. Now she was sitting beside Victor Moretti with blood still under his fingernails and a diamond on her hand. They drove through the iron gates of the compound, and the heavy metal locked behind them with a loud clang. Victor turned off the engine, but neither of them moved. They sat in the blue glow of the dashboard lights, while Nora's anger finally faded enough for guilt to come in. Quietly, Nora admitted she did not actually want Arthur hurt. Victor already knew. He told her he had men watching Arthur's apartment, and Carmine's people would not get anywhere near him. She had called Carmine's bluff, and that was what saved them. Relief hit Nora so hard she nearly closed her eyes right there. She asked why Victor was protecting Arthur. Victor looked at her, his eyes dark, and said he had known Carmine would try to use her past against her. If anyone was going to ruin that pathetic accountant's life, it should be Nora, on her own terms, not as a pawn in someone else's war. The intensity of his voice left her breathless. It was not soft romance. It was raw, protective, possessive, and unlike anything she had ever known. Arthur could not choose wallpaper without his mother's opinion. Victor had deployed armed men to protect Nora's right, to decide what happened to her own pain. Without thinking, Nora reached across the console and pressed her hand to Victor's chest. Beneath his suit jacket, his heartbeat was slow and powerful. Victor froze, his eyes locking onto her face as the air in the car turned heavy. Whispered her name like a warning, but it did not feel like rejection. Nora admitted the truth. She had used him in the warehouse. She had not cared about the money or the trust. She had only wanted to do something so wild and permanent that Arthur could never undo it. She had wanted to burn her old life to the ground and step out of the ashes as someone else. Victor's voice dropped as he covered her hand with his. He said they had both used each other, and it was only business. Nora looked at his bruised face and asked if that was really all it was. Victor did not answer with words. Victor's hand slid to the back of Nora's neck, fingers tangling in her hair, and he pulled her across the console. The kiss was not gentle. It was messy, hard, and fueled by adrenaline, scotch, and fear, and everything neither of them wanted to say. It felt less like romance and more like two damaged people colliding in the dark, both startled by the heat they found there. Nora gasped against his mouth, gripping his jacket as Victor wrapped an arm around her waist like a steel band and lifted her out of her seat. The giant diamond ring dug into his shoulder, but he did not seem to notice. All the chaos, fear, betrayal, and anger of the last 3 days crashed into that one moment. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard in the quiet car. Nothing had been solved. In fact, everything had just become much more complicated. Picture this: Victor leaning in, forehead against Nora's, looking like a man who was completely exhausted and completely gone for her. He whispered that she was going to be the death of him, and for once it did not sound like a line. Nora, still clutching his jacket, tried to keep her voice steady and asked if he was not just a businessman. Victor opened those dark eyes and said he never lost what he had claimed. A red flag, absolutely. But what a line. 2 weeks later, the summer heat had broken, autumn was creeping in, and Nora had not returned to anything resembling normal. She had moved into the compound, not because Victor forced her every second, but because every time she imagined leaving, she imagined Russo eyes in every window. Fear kept her there at first. Then something more complicated took its place. Nora learned the rhythm of Victor's world. Men arrived at midnight with bruised faces and quiet reports. Phones rang at breakfast and made everyone go silent. Leo developed a nervous twitch every time Nora asked a legal question, which only made her ask more of them. At first, she stayed out of the business, because she told herself she was not one of them. But Carmine's words kept bothering her. Real wives knew things. Real wives had power. Real wives survived more than one dinner. So Nora started reading. Doc contracts, trust clauses, shell company names, shipment schedules. She told herself it was self-defense. Then she found patterns Victor's men had missed, because they were looking for threats with guns, not threats hidden in invoices. She knew marketing analytics, spreadsheets, margins, and human behavior. Crime, as it turned out, also had data. And the data said Carmine was not backing down. He was moving quietly. One night, Nora found 3 payments routed through a consulting firm with a cheerful logo and no real office. The money led to a port inspector, then to a private security company, then to a board member who had been smiling too much in every meeting. She took the file to Victor's study, expecting him to dismiss it. He did not. He read in silence, his face getting colder with every page. When he finished, he asked how she had found it. Nora said people always leave fingerprints where they think women will not look. Victor stared at her for a long moment, then called Leo. By dawn, the compound was awake. Carmine had not been planning another dinner. He had been preparing a board challenge. If he could make Victor look unstable and the marriage look hollow, the board could reopen the trust, freeze the ports, and cut Victor's empire in half without firing a single shot. That was when Nora finally understood the real danger. Carmine was not just a gangster with threats and men at doors. He was patient. He was smart. He knew how to make paperwork feel like a blade. Victor wanted to respond the old way. Nora could see it in his hands, in the way he reached for his jacket before he reached for the evidence. She stopped him. Her voice shook, but she stopped him anyway. She said if he stormed into Carmine's world with guns, Carmine would win because the board was waiting for Victor to prove he was exactly the monster they feared. Victor looked at her like no one had ever told him no and survived. Nora looked back like she was learning to survive it in real time. Then she said they needed to beat Carmine in the room where he thought she was weakest, the boardroom. Victor hated the plan. Leo hated it more. Nora wore them both down. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning in a private conference room above the harbor. All glass walls, gray skies, and men old enough to believe a woman in a silk blouse was decoration. Carmine arrived with a smile, 3 lawyers, and the confidence of a man who thought he had already won. Victor sat beside Nora, silent and dangerous. Leo looked like he might faint into his briefcase. Carmine opened with the photos from the warehouse. He called Nora a convenient bride, a desperate woman dragged from a bar to commit fraud. Then he questioned Victor's judgment, the rushed filing, and every weak spot he thought he had found. The board members shifted in their seats. Nora felt the room moving against them. Her throat went dry. For one terrible second, she wanted to run. Then she remembered Arthur, Lydia, the broken frame, and every room where she had made herself smaller to keep other people comfortable. Nora stood before Victor could stop her. Her knees were weak, but her voice came out steady. She said Carmine was right about one thing. She had not been born into their world. That was exactly why she could see what they kept missing. Men like Carmine counted on fear, tradition, and everyone assuming violence was the only language in the room. Then she opened her laptop and put the payment trail on the screen. One company after another, one fake consultant after another, one board member's account glowing like a flare at the end of it all. Carmine's smile thinned. Nora did not bury the room in legal language. She kept it simple. Money left a fake company, reached a port inspector, and came back through people loyal to Carmine. It was a spreadsheet, clean and merciless, and it cut deeper than a threat because no one could argue with the numbers. The boardroom changed. Men who had been leaning toward Carmine suddenly leaned away. The compromised board member started sweating through his collar. Carmine's lawyers whispered too fast. Victor did not move, but Nora felt his focus on her like heat. Carmine stood slowly and asked if Victor had trained his little wife to perform. Nora looked at him and said no. Victor had made the mistake of leaving her alone with the files. A few men almost smiled. Carmine did not. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Nora and Victor could hear. He said she should remember her mother still lived in a house with ordinary locks. Before Victor could rise, Nora clicked one last file open. Security footage. Carmine's man meeting the port inspector. Carmine's voice on a recorded call, threatening to use Nora's family if the marriage held. The room went still. Nora had saved the worst for last. She was not just defending herself anymore. She was exposing him. Carmine lunged before anyone expected it. Not with a gun. That would have been too easy. He grabbed Nora's wrist hard enough to bruise and hissed that she had no idea what she had done. Victor moved so fast the chair behind him hit the floor. His hand closed around Carmine's throat and drove him back against the glass wall. For one breathless second, everyone saw the monster Carmine had wanted to provoke from the start. Nora knew what would happen if Victor lost control. The board would remember the violence, not the evidence. So she stepped forward, wrist throbbing, and put her hand on Victor's arm, not begging, not pleading. Commanding. She said his name once. Victor froze. The room held its breath. Slowly, painfully, he released Carmine. Nora looked at the board and said they had all seen enough. Her voice did not shake this time. The old men nodded because finally they had. Carmine left that boardroom without his smile, without his leverage, and without the clean victory he had spent weeks building. The compromised board member was removed before lunch. The trust was confirmed by unanimous vote. The port contracts were locked under Victor's control. By evening, Carmine's own allies were calling him careless. which in that world was almost worse than calling him weak. Nora should have felt triumphant. Instead, she sat alone in Victor's kitchen, staring at the purple fingerprints blooming around her wrist. She had won, but the win had cost her something. Innocence, exactly. Maybe the last illusion that she could step into this world without it leaving marks. Victor found her there near midnight. He took her wrist gently and unsted bruises like they were a personal failure. Nora expected rage. Instead, he looked tired. He said she had saved him from giving Carmine exactly what he wanted. She asked if that scared him. Victor said yes. Next morning, before Leo arrived with more papers, Nora got one final reminder that her old life had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for an opening. Arthur came to the compound gate with Lydia in the passenger seat of his dented sedan, both of them looking small beneath the security cameras. Victor's men wanted to send them away. Nora told them to let the car stop outside the gate, but not 1 inch farther. Arthur stepped out first, clutching a wilted bouquet like a guilty schoolboy. Lydia stayed behind the windshield, pale and angry, no longer playing fragile quite so well. Arthur begged through the intercom, saying he had made a mistake, saying Lydia meant nothing, saying Nora was not thinking clearly. Then he said the worst thing he could have said, that Victor had brainwashed her. Nora looked at him through the iron bars and finally understood how little he had ever known her. Nora walked closer, calm enough to frighten even herself. She told Arthur he had mistaken obedience for love and silence for weakness. He had not lost her to Victor. He had lost her the moment he decided she would forgive anything, just to keep the life they had planned. Lydia got out then, crying for real this time, and whispered that Arthur had manipulated her, that she had been lonely, that sisters should not end like this. Nora looked at the woman who had once been her best friend and felt the ache of it, but not the pull. She told Lydia that forgiveness was not a door she could pound on whenever guilt got cold. Then she handed Arthur back the engagement ring he had not noticed she was still carrying in her pocket. It dropped into his palm like a tiny piece of wreckage. Nora turned away before either of them could answer. Behind her, the gate closed with a final metallic groan. That was the moment Nora knew she was not going back. Not to Arthur, not to Lydia, not to the woman who had spent years making room for people who only knew how to take. Inside the house, Leo slid a thick folder toward her at the kitchen island, like it might explode. He tapped the folder with his gold pen and gave her the news. The board had recognized the trust. The Russo challenge had collapsed, and the war was officially over for now. Nora was free, but of course, there was a catch. Leo glanced around nervously and pushed the annulment papers closer. Victor had asked him to draft them before sunrise. The trust required Victor to be married to inherit the assets, but it never said how long the marriage had to last. A loophole. Nora signed, the whole Mafia nightmare would legally disappear, and she would walk away with $5 million deposited cleanly into an offshore account. The pen felt ice cold in Nora's hand, dragging her right back to that warehouse. She asked where Victor was and wanted her to sign so she could return to her normal life. Nora looked at the papers and saw her maiden name. Nora Hayes. It felt wrong. It looked like a stranger's name. For 2 weeks, she had lived inside this velvet cage, juggling corporate Zoom calls while muting herself whenever mob lieutenants came in to report on shipments, threats, and bloodier things left unsaid. She had eaten takeout at 2 a.m. with a man everyone feared. She had exposed Carmine in a boardroom, faced Arthur at the gate, and finally stopped letting Lydia's tears decide what she owed. How was she supposed to go back to spreadsheets and pretend none of that had changed her, and tore them straight down the middle? Leo gasped and clutched his chest like she had personally wounded him. He stammered that those were legally binding drafts. Nora tore them into quarters and dropped them in the trash. Then she told him to print the third quarter doc reports because she wanted to review the margins before meeting the old board members at 11. Unable to understand that she was choosing to stay, Nora calmly took a sip of coffee and said she was Victor's wife, not go around strangling shareholders during meetings. For the first time in a long time, she was not being dragged by the story. She was writing it. Still, her hand shook around the coffee cup. Choosing danger did not make danger romantic. It made the choice honest. Nora was not blind. She knew what Victor was. She also knew what she had become beside him. Nora slid off the stool and walked down the dark hallway toward the study. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and found Victor standing by the window, staring out at the gray morning. He wore a shoulder holster over a crisp white shirt. He did not turn around, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. He knew she was there. In a rough, controlled voice, he asked if Leo had given her the papers. Nora stepped onto the rug and said the font was ugly, so she threw them in the trash. Victor went still. Then he turned his head slowly, dark eyes locking onto hers, and warned her not to play games. He was offering her an exit. He expected her to take it while she still could. Nora saw then that the papers were not kindness alone. They were fear. Victor Moretti, who could face guns without blinking, was afraid of being chosen for real. Victor told her she could go back to spreadsheets and safety, or stay and drown in blood. Nora did not back down. She stepped closer to the monster who had terrified her, protected her, used her, trusted her, and somehow made her feel more awake than anyone ever had. Looking him straight in the eyes, she told him she did not want the exit. Arthur had made her feel like a side character in her own life. Victor made her feel like she was holding the pen, but she was not staying to be hidden, decorated, or protected until she forgot her own name. She was staying as his partner. Victor pulled her close and whispered that if they were partners, God help the city. Then his phone lit up on the desk. One message from an unknown number. Carmine is gone. His son is coming. Victor looked at Nora. Nora looked at the dark screen and smiled, not because she was safe, but because this time, whatever came next, the choice was hers.